Fishing rod was still leaning against the back wall of the garage. My old work gloves were still draped over the porch railing, right where I'd left them the night before. I had not taken them with me because I told myself I was coming back. I told myself a lot of things that week. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working for a sheet metal fabrication company in Central Ohio. I started on the floor and worked my way up to operations supervisor. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because I want you to understand who I was before any of this happened. A man who showed up. A man who did what needed to be done, even when it was hard, even when it was exhausting, even when nobody said thank you. That's who I had been my whole life, and somehow that still wasn't enough. My wife and I had been married for 9 years when it started. She was 54. Her daughter was 29. Her daughter's husband, I'll call him my son-in-law, though it never really felt that way. He was 32. They had been living in an apartment about 40 minutes from us in Columbus. Nothing fancy, but functional. They both had jobs. Things seemed fine from the outside. Then one evening in February, my wife sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said her daughter needed to move back home for a while. She and her husband both. She said they were having some financial difficulties. She said it in that careful way she had. Soft tone, eyes slightly down, the way she talked when she'd already made up her mind and was just informing me of the decision. I asked how long. She said she didn't know. A few months, maybe. I said okay. Because that's what I did. I said, okay. We had a 3-bedroom house on the east side of Columbus. It was my house. I had owned it for 11 years before my wife and I married. I put her name on the deed 2 years in because that's what you do when you trust someone, when you believe it's going to last. I want you to remember that detail because it matters later. Her daughter and son-in-law moved in on a Saturday. I helped carry boxes. I rearranged the garage to make room for their things. I gave them the spare bedroom, which had been my home office, and I moved my desk out to a corner of the basement. I didn't complain. I told myself it was temporary. But there's something about a house that shifts when a new set of adults moves in. It's not dramatic. It's small. It's the way the refrigerator starts getting reorganized without anyone asking. It's the way the television is on a different channel when you come home. It's the way you start to feel like a guest in the rooms you've known for over a decade. Her son-in-law was not an unkind man, exactly. He wasn't cruel. He was just thoroughly convinced that his preferences mattered more than yours. He would take the last of the coffee without making a new pot. He would park behind my truck in the driveway in a way that meant I had to ask him to move it every single morning before work. Small things, but they were every day, and my wife didn't see any of it, or she chose not to. Her daughter was warmer on the surface but colder underneath. She had that particular talent some people have of making you feel like you're being difficult just for existing. She'd say things like, "Oh, we didn't think you'd mind," after they'd used the last of something or rearranged something I'd had in the same place for a decade, and I'd stand there and think, well, I do mind, actually. But by that point the moment was already past. 3 months became 6. 6 became 9. My wife stopped asking if everything was okay. I think she already knew. And she decided that keeping the peace with her daughter was more important than addressing my discomfort. I understood it in a way. She loved her daughter, but I had thought she also loved me. And love, I've learned, shows itself in the small choices. In whether you defend your husband when your son-in-law parks behind his truck for the 5th time in a week. In whether you check in after you've upended someone's living arrangement without a real end date. She stopped checking in some around month 7. The night it broke open, it was an ordinary Thursday. I had come home from a 10-hour day. My knees were aching, they always do now, and I found my son-in-law sitting in my recliner watching television and my wife and daughter at the kitchen table, talking and laughing. I went to pour myself a cup of coffee, and the pot was empty and cold. No one had thought to make more. I didn't say anything. I made a new pot, sat down at the kitchen table, and waited for someone to acknowledge I was there. A few minutes passed. Then my wife glanced at me and said, without any preamble, that she and her daughter had been talking, and they thought it might be better if I moved into the basement bedroom. Just for a while. To get the kids a little more space on the main floor. She said it like it was a minor scheduling adjustment. She said it with her daughter nodding along beside her. I looked at my wife for a long moment. I asked her if she was serious. She said she knew it was a lot to ask, but they would really appreciate it. That phrase, "they would really appreciate it," landed somewhere in the center of my chest, and I felt it like a physical thing. I told her I would need to think about it. I went down to the basement, and I sat on the old couch that used to be in the living room before they took over the living room, and I sat there until almost midnight, and I thought about what had just happened. Not just that night. All of it. Every small thing, stacked one on top of the other, over the course of nearly a year. I thought about a morning back in December when I had been getting ready for work, and I came into the kitchen and my son-in-law was on a phone call, and he had waved me off. Actually, waved me off with his hand, like you'd shoo a dog, because I was making noise pouring cereal. In my own kitchen, at 7 in the morning, I thought about a Sunday when her daughter had rearranged my entire pantry because she said my system didn't make sense and my wife had sided with her daughter. I thought about the fishing rod still leaning against the back wall of the garage, and the gloves on the railing, and how I used to come home and feel settled in a way I no longer felt anywhere in that house. I went upstairs and I told my wife, calmly, that I was not moving to the basement, that this was my house, our house, and I had bent as far as I was willing to bend. And if that was not acceptable, then we had a much bigger problem than sleeping arrangements. She looked at me for a moment. Then she turned back toward the hallway and she said, "I just think you could be more flexible." That was the last thing she said to me that night. I lay in our bed in the dark, and I decided that I needed to stop waiting for the situation to fix itself. I had been waiting 11 months. It was not going to fix itself. The next morning, I called in late to work. I was at my bank when they opened at 9. I had 2 accounts, a joint checking account with my wife and a personal savings account that was mine alone, left over from before we married, and always kept separate. I withdrew the balance from my personal savings and put it into a new account under my name only at a different institution. The joint account I left alone. I was not trying to be malicious, but I was no longer going to be unprepared. I also called an attorney that morning. He was a family law attorney, a man I'd been referred to by a coworker who had been through a divorce a few years back. I did not commit to anything in that call. I just asked questions. I wanted to understand where I stood. He told me that because the house was a marital asset, even if I had owned it beforehand, the situation was more complicated than simply being the original owner. He said I should document everything. I started doing that. I didn't move out that day, or the next, but something had shifted inside me. I stopped asking to be considered. I stopped adjusting. I started being very still and very clear, and I watched to see if anyone noticed. No one did. It was a Saturday, 5 weeks later, when I made the decision to go. Not because she asked me to, not because she asked me to, not because they pushed me out, but because I finally understood that staying was costing me something I could not afford to lose, my own sense of who I was. I had spent 63 years building a particular kind of man, patient, dependable, capable, and I had let 11 months chip away at all 3. I wasn't going to let it take the rest. I packed a bag, 2 changes of clothes, my toiletries, my laptop, the folder with my important documents that I'd already moved to my car 2 weeks earlier, and a photograph of my son, my actual son, from my first marriage who lives up in Michigan, that I kept on the nightstand. I did not take anything that could be considered joint property. I left my fishing rod. I left the gloves. I figured I'd come back for them eventually. I drove to a residence inn about 8 miles away. I had looked it up the week before. Weekly rates, a kitchenette, a small desk. It cost me more than I wanted to spend, but I needed to be somewhere that was unambiguously mine. The first night I sat at that small desk and I ate a sandwich I had picked up at a gas station, and I watched the news, and I felt something I hadn't expected. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something more like relief, threaded through with grief. The relief of a man who has been holding his breath for almost a year and has finally exhaled. The grief of knowing that exhale means something is over. I called my son that night. He lives in Grand Rapids with his wife and my 2 grandchildren. And when I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, I've been worried about you for months." I hadn't known he'd seen it. That got me more than I expected. I had to put the phone down for a few seconds. I stayed at the residence inn for 6 weeks while the attorney worked on things. I had gone back to the house once, with the attorney's knowledge, and while my wife was home. I wasn't trying to hide anything, to get more of my belongings. My son-in-law was there. He stood in the hallway and watched me without saying anything. My wife stood in the kitchen doorway. She said, quietly, that she hoped we could talk. I told her my attorney would be in touch. She flinched a little at that. I think it was the first time the full weight of what was happening landed on her. The divorce took 14 months. The house was the main issue. In the end, we sold it and split the proceeds, which wasn't what I had hoped for. But it was clean. I took my half and I bought a small place outside of Westerville. Ranch style, 1 floor, easier on my knees. 2 bedrooms, a decent yard, a garage big enough for my tools, and a small workshop. The first weekend I was there, I set my fishing rod against the back wall. Old habit. I had taken early retirement by then. The company had been offering packages to senior employees for about a year, and with everything going on, I had decided to take mine. I wasn't done working, but I was done working for someone else. I had a workshop, I had tools, and I had 31 years of fabrication knowledge. I started doing small metalwork jobs out of my garage, custom brackets, repair work, small decorative commissions, mostly referrals at first, through old co-workers and neighbors. I built a simple website, nothing elaborate, and I set up a business profile on Google. I priced my work fairly. I showed up when I said I would. Within a year, I had more work than I could reliably take on alone. About 2.5 years after I left, I was sitting in my workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, finishing up a set of custom gate hinges for a customer out in New Albany, and my phone buzzed. It was a new inquiry through my business profile. A woman asking about custom metalwork for a renovation project. She'd found me through Google, she said. She liked my reviews. I almost didn't recognize the email address. It was her daughter's. My former stepdaughter. I stared at it for a long moment. I thought about responding myself. Then I decided not to. I had a young man who helped me part-time with inquiries and scheduling, a college kid named, well, it doesn't matter. I forwarded him the inquiry and asked him to handle the response. I told him I wasn't available for new projects for the next 6 weeks, which was true. A few days later, another email came through my contact form. This one was from my ex-wife directly. It was short. She said she'd seen my name come up. Apparently she had been with her daughter when she found my listing and recognized the business name, and she said she just wanted to reach out. She said she knew things hadn't ended well. She said she thought about it sometimes. She said she hoped I was doing all right. I read it twice. I closed the laptop. I thought about what I might have said to her a few years ago, when the hurt was still raw. I had rehearsed versions of that conversation more times than I'd like to admit. In those first months, in the hotel room, in the early mornings in my new house when sleep wouldn't come back, I had been angry, genuinely angry, in a way I don't think I had ever let myself be in my life. I was raised to manage it, contain it, and I contained it for so long that when it finally came up, I didn't know what to do with it. But sitting there in my workshop, with the hinges finished and the evening light coming through the window at that low angle you only get in October in Ohio, I found that I didn't have much left to say to her. Not out of bitterness, out of completion, the version of me that had needed her to understand, to really sit with what she had done and acknowledge it. That version had slowly stopped needing it. Somewhere in the second year. I wrote back 3 days later. I kept it brief. I said I was doing well. I said I hoped she was too. I said I didn't have the bandwidth for a longer conversation, but I appreciated her reaching out. She replied within an hour. She said she was glad I was well. She said her daughter and son-in-law had moved out last year. She said the house felt different. Emptier, she called it. I read that, and I sat with it for a moment. Then I closed my laptop again and went back to the hinges. I had a delivery to make in the morning, and I still needed to wire brush the edges. My son came down with his family the following month. We fished at a reservoir about 20 minutes from my place. Nothing remarkable, caught a few bass, threw most of them back. My grandson sat between us in the boat and asked me every 10 minutes if there were sharks in Ohio lakes, and every time I told him no, he looked slightly disappointed and slightly relieved at the same time. My son and I didn't talk much about the past. We didn't need to. At one point, while we were waiting for a bite, he looked out at the water, and he said, You seem like yourself again, Dad. I thought about that for a while before I answered. I told him I think I'm more myself now than I've been in a long time, maybe more than I ever was in certain ways, because there's a kind of man you can only become after you've lost something significant. Not harder exactly, and not colder, just clearer. Clearer about what you're willing to accept. Clearer about what you're not. Clearer about the fact that starting over at 63 is not the tragedy it looks like from the outside. It is just starting over. And that is allowed. At any age, that is allowed. The fishing rod is still leaning against the back wall of my garage, right where I put it, the first weekend I moved in. Some habits, it turns out, are worth keeping.